We're going to cut across you there, I'm afraid. We're going to take you live to the House of Commons. We're getting a statement about the infected blood crisis. Let's listen in.
A huge amount of work on an intensely complex issue, ensuring that victims' voices are heard. I've been deeply moved by the testimonies outlined in the latest report, and the victims' bravery in coming forward should not be overlooked. The issuing of the second interim report, specifically on compensation, was not anticipated by the government until we were informed by the inquiry in February this year. However, we very much appreciate and welcome Sir Brian taking this approach. The government is considering intensely the recommendations outlined in this report, and work is underway at pace across all relevant departments to respond fully. My right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, announced the infected blood inquiry in 2017 to examine the circumstances that led to individuals being given contaminated blood and blood products in the UK. The inquiry, chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff, commenced on the 2nd of July 2018, and I'd like to reiterate our total endorsement for my right honourable friend's point that the contaminated blood scandal of the 70s and 80s should simply never have happened. In tandem with the ongoing inquiry, my right honourable friend, the member for Portsmouth North, as the then Paymaster General, commissioned Sir Robert Francis KC to produce a compensation framework study in anticipation of a recommendation from the inquiry to set up a compensation scheme. The findings of this study were published in June 2022. Shortly after this, Sir Brian published his first interim report of the infected blood inquiry in July 2022. In his report, Sir Brian recommended that the government make interim payments to infected individuals and their bereaved partners. The government accepted this recommendation in full on the 17th of August 2022, and interim compensation payments of £100,000 have been paid to those infected individuals and their bereaved partners registered with existing support schemes. As I said to the House in December, we have much to do, and I wish to assure the House that this is a priority for the government and we will continue to progress it. Those are my words in December, and I would like to assure the House that this commitment absolutely remains. Sir Brian's most recent report sets out what the inquiry recommends as an appropriate means of compensating both those infected and affected, and the mechanism for delivering that compensation. In doing so, it sets out the complexity of what is a multi-layered issue. The recommendations in his report outline that those infected and affected should be granted legal support, and infected and affected people and the estates of infected people should be able to claim for categories of loss against 5 awards: Injury Impact Award, Social Impact Award, Autonomy Award, Care Award and Financial Loss Award. This is rather than claiming on individual assessment of each application. In addition, those dissatisfied with their compensation payments should have redress through an appeal to a structure outside of the compensation scheme. The report has also proposed mechanisms Sir Brian thinks would ensure the fairness of the compensation scheme. He has recommended that a scheme is administered by an arm's-length body, chaired by a High Court judge or equivalent, and advised by legal and medical professionals, as well as the beneficiaries of the scheme. In addition to this, Sir Brian has proposed that the route through the courts should still remain open to beneficiaries. Sir Brian has agreed with much of Sir Robert's study, though there are also differences in approach. For example, Sir Robert outlined in his study that the scheme should be delivered locally in each of the 4 nations, as this was the preference of the victims. Sir Brian has recommended that the scheme is delivered by a central body, whilst continuing the support provided by the existing infected blood support schemes, which should be continued and guaranteed for life by legislation or secure government undertaking. There is also divergence in the consideration of scope of those eligible for compensation payments, including the extension of payments to those with hepatitis B and not providing payments to the estates of those affected. Sir Brian's interim report is detailed. It is only right that the government will need to consider the complexities they set out thoroughly when preparing our response. The House will recognise that health is a devolved matter, and I'll be discussing the report with my colleagues in the devolved administrations. As I said at the start of my statement, the government welcomes the publication of the Infected Blood Inquiry's second interim report to assist its ongoing work. However, we do not underestimate the complexity of these recommendations, which do need careful consideration. For example, Sir Brian recommends that an arm's-length body, in which His Majesty's Government would have no ongoing role beyond providing taxpayer funds as required by the body. On anything like this scale, this would be a new departure, and does have implications for accountability of government, which will need careful consideration alongside how its financial implications will be managed. I would, however, like to reassure the House that while the government is progressing work to ensure that we are in the best possible position to respond fully at the end of the inquiry, every recommendation by Sir Brian, including in relation to timing and a further interim payment, is receiving intense focus. My colleagues in the Department for Health and Social Care are aware of the issues Sir Brian has raised in relation to psychological support. Under the current psychological support scheme for England, there is provision for a grant of up to £900 a year for established beneficiaries and family members for counselling and talking therapy. The Department for Health and Social Care is undertaking research to look at the psychological support needs so that decisions on commissioning of bespoke service are based on robust evidence and meet the requirement. In closing, I would like to reiterate the need for pace. People die every week as a result of the impact of the scandal. This government wants to deliver resolution, and we are working at pace across all relevant departments to consider the recommendations as outlined in this latest report and to ensure we are best placed to respond to the inquiry's final report. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I thank the Paymaster General for providing an advanced copy of his statement. I'd like to begin by paying tribute to the brave victims and their families who, whilst working through their own personal ill health, grief and trauma, have campaigned tirelessly for justice. Without their strength, we would not have reached this stage. And of course, to my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, who's been a stalwart of the success of this campaign so far. The continued work of the Infected Blood Inquiry is crucial to ensuring that victims' voices are heard. I had the privilege of meeting with victims of this scandal last month, and their stories will stay with me forever. No one should have to experience the pain and anguish they have faced and are still facing. Justice delayed, continuing to be delayed, is justice denied. While we await the conclusion of the report and inquiry, those who are given contaminated blood products are dying at a rate of 1 every 4 days. Families have suffered decades of health issues, financial loss and stigma. Victims, those affected and infected, will have watched the Minister's statement today with heavy hearts and disappointment and some degree of anger. There seems to be no commitment from the Minister to respond to the second report until the final report is published in the autumn. The interim report was published so that the government doesn't have to wait and to take action until the final report. Exactly. Whilst we all understand the complexities of this scandal, I hope the Minister can see that many individuals directly affected still feel angry and unrecognised. Yeah. Today's statement does not provide any certainty for families or children of victims. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have 5 questions for the Minister to finish with. First, does he agree with Sir Brian's statement in the interim report that time without redress is harmful? No time must be wasted in delivering that redress. And can he confirm that the intense focus that he's talked about being done now is to achieve the recommendation in the report that the scheme is set up now and should begin work this year? Second, how can he provide more reassurance to family members of victims, including parents who lost children and children orphaned when their parents died? Third, the Paymaster General talked about work underway. If the government plans to accept these interim findings, officials must start now verifying, registering directly affected people and their families urgently to understand the size of the group and to speed up the payments. Can he confirm whether this is already taking place? Fourth, will he commit to more regular updates on the progress and direction of travel on this issue ahead of the inquiry's final report later this year? We shouldn't have to keep squeezing this information out of the government because it compounds the pain of the victims. And finally, will he agree to meet with me and my right honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, so that we can work together to deliver the justice the victims deserve?
Minister. We've been hearing from the Cabinet Minister, Jeremy Quin, who has outlined the government's reaction to the interim report on the Tainted Blood inquiry. This was Sir Brian Langstaff's inquiry, which did set out quite a detailed amount of information about the kind of compensation families should receive. The government says that it is a priority for the government looking at the mechanism, that they are setting out a framework of legal support for families and for the estates of those who died. They want it to be delivered by a central body, money for counselling. Fleur Anderson for Labour, though, saying that it's not really quick enough. They want the government to act quickly. Time without redress is harmful, they pointed out, quoting Sir Brian Langstaff from his inquiry's interim findings. Let's bring in our political correspondent, Amanda Acas, who's here with me in the studio. Amanda, we could potentially be talking about a lot of money here, couldn't we? So it's perhaps no surprise that the government is being a little bit circumspect about what it's actually going to give. But what are the nuts and bolts of what they've announced?
Yes, so this is the second part, really, of the inquiry's recommendations that we've had so far. So people who were directly affected themselves by the infected blood scandal, of course, from receiving those contaminated blood products in the 70s and 80s, have received an interim amount of compensation of up to £100,000. That happened in October. Now, when that happened, there was some considerable anger from other people, in particular the parents of children who lost their lives as a result, and children who lost their parents as a result of this, that they weren't included under that original compensation scheme. Now, just last month, at the start of this month, the chair of the inquiry issued another interim report recommending that they should also have their own compensation scheme, talking about the need for speed because of that frustration. Many of them, of course, waited already so many years from this, not had that support over so many years. And indeed, we heard Labour there making the point that 1 in 4 people affected by this are dying at a rate, a very, very rapid rate, because of the ill health of that they've suffered as a result. Now, there have been a number of different reports looking at the kind of scope of this compensation, and that's really what the Minister was talking about there, Jeremy Quin, when he was talking about the complexity of setting up a sort of arm's-length body as a structure to kind of decide on 5 different categories of compensation, how that would work, how it would be administered. He did insist that they were working on this at pace, but basically suggested they're not quite ready to do that yet, and will be waiting for the result of the final report to be delivered later on. I think for many families, as we were hearing from Labour there will be a great deal of hurt that this isn't happening more quickly. But certainly, as you say, it is a complex matter to administer for the government, also making reference to the fact that health is a devolved matter, so it's not something that's just that is just done in Westminster as well. So many questions, I think, still to be answered.
Amanda, thanks very much. Well, later this hour, we will be getting reaction from the families affected. I'm going to be talking to a solicitor and advisor to around 1,500 victims of the infected blood scandal, so stay tuned for that.